January 3rd, 1975, and I'm interviewing Eli Rock in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Well, my career with the JDC dates from early May 1945. The war had ended a couple of months, a relatively brief period earlier, and I had been in Europe during the war, and I was able to get myself demobilized in Europe, and I was looking around for a job. I had little or no relationship with the organized Jewish community up to then, and in fact, a Christian friend of mine who was with UNRWA at that point and who was unable to help me find a job with UNRWA referred me to the JDC, whom he had had contact with, and the JDC hired me partly because my French at that time was pretty good, and I had served in the French army, and that had improved it, and they needed an American who could translate for some of the French Jewish officials who were constantly coming into the Paris office and who had some administrative experience, which I had had. And after working with the JDC, with Joe Schwartz and Arthur Greenlee in the Paris office for a couple of months during a time when the JDC's staff was literally skeletal. Very few people had yet come over from the States, and the war with Japan was still going on, so shipping was tied up, and it hadn't been possible to bring supplies over for distribution. There was no organized program as yet in Germany. In fact, when I first went to work for the JDC, we hadn't yet received permission to operate in Germany, and part of our job at that point was to get clearance from the Army to run a program in Germany, which would be under the Army's general supervision and control.
When did you get that permission?
It must have been around June 1945, perhaps latter May. There was a great deal of back and forth discussion and negotiation on that. In any event, with staff very sparse, and with my having had contact with the American Army, because in serving with the French Army, I served as part of the 6th Army Group, which was run by the American Army.
How did you get involved with the French Army?
I was an ambulance driver for the American Field Service and had gone over during the war in that capacity. I was 4F and I couldn't serve in the American Army. Because of my experience in Germany with the American Army, and because the needs were so desperate and urgent at that point, and because of the sparsity of the more normal type of social worker staff, I was sent back into Germany to head up the JDC's program, which was then non-existent, in Bavaria, all of Bavaria, which quickly became the focal point of the whole displaced persons program. Most of the Jews ended up in DP camps. Well, the largest single number of Jewish DPs were in Bavaria. There were a lot eventually in Bergen-Belsen and some in the northern Bavaria or Hesse area around Frankfurt, but Bavaria was the main point. The survivors of Dachau were there already. Some of the survivors of other camps came to Bavaria after they had heard that there were some camps there, displaced persons camps, and it became quickly the focal point. I served there for the JDC from July 1945 into December 1945, at which point the original 6 months or so for which I had agreed to stay had expired. My career is that of a lawyer in labor relations, and I was anxious to get back to my regular field of work. And I remember being in New York in January of '46, and Dr. Joseph Schwartz, the head of the JDC's European program, was then in New York also, and he invited me up to his apartment for dinner one night and fed me at least 3 strong drinks of scotch. And by the end of the evening, I had agreed to go back to Germany for the JDC. And at that point, he assigned me to head up the JDC's program in Berlin. And Henry Levy was my co-director. And I went back at that point into Berlin, where I remained for the JDC until, that would be from January 1946 until the early part of 1947, January or February 47. And that was the period of when we had this tremendous return flow of Jews from Poland into Germany, and Berlin was one of the main entry points. These were Jews who had either gone back to Poland from the DP camps, from the concentration camps in Germany, and had found a barren wasteland insofar as Judaism was concerned. Everybody was dead or gone, and furthermore, they found that their Polish neighbors were as virulently anti-Semitic as they had ever been, and there was the Kielce pogrom in 1946, Kielce, in which some 30 Jews were killed. And they were coming, in addition, a large number of Jews had begun to come back into Poland from the Soviet Union. They were the ones who had been in eastern Poland when the Nazis poured across Poland and had fled into the Soviet Union, where they had spent the rest of the war generally in some sort of camps or in community living. And when they came back to Poland, they found the same barren wasteland, and they then, in what is, both of these flows represent a supreme irony of history. The Jews who had been killed and decimated by the Germans were now fleeing from their allied country, Poland, back into this same Germany for safety, but also for emigration. And the 2 main entry points during 1946 into the DP camps in Western Germany were Berlin and Czechoslovakia on into Bavaria. And we had as many as some weeks 2,000 people coming in with tremendous problems and a tremendous burden. Now, I started to say that earlier that in the Bavarian period, I had the unique experience, and particularly in the first part of my 6 months or 5 months there, 6 months of working closely with chaplain Abraham Klausner. And in my year in Berlin, the chaplain for the American Army during much or most of that year was Herbert Friedman, who later became the head of United Jewish Appeal in this country, Rabbi Herbert Friedman, and also, in the latter part of my stay, Rabbi Meir Abramowitz, who is now a rabbi at the Temple Menorah in Miami, whom I incidentally spoke to on the phone just a week ago when I was there. Now, these are the 3 chaplains I knew best in my year and a half, roughly, in Germany. I did also meet Max Browdy at that point, and a chaplain in Bavaria whose name escapes me now, but you might be able to remind me of his name. And one or two others, but these are the three who were the most active and who were the most involved in the Displaced Persons program, because in Berlin, the chaplain's residence in the American sector of Berlin was a gathering place for the displaced persons who were in Berlin, and was a gathering place for GIs in that area who rendered considerable help to the DPs who were in Berlin.
Fine. All right. Now let's start with Rabbi Klausner. How, when, and under what circumstances did you first come into contact with Rabbi Klausner?
I came into Munich with a team of 4 people that the JDC had sent me, all Europeans. Ruth, I think it was Ruth Landau or something like that, who was a nurse, a French Jewish nurse, I think. More importantly, Dr. and Madame Henri Heitan, Heitan, who was our medical doctor. He was originally a Polish doctor who had lived in France for many years, and his wife, Ruth Charlotte, or Charlotte Ruth, we called her Ruth, came along as a sort of an administrative assistant for the team. And then we had a man named Holzer, who was, a general all-around assistant, who was a Polish Jew who had been a prisoner of war. He had been in the Polish army during the war, and he'd been in a prisoner of war camp and had managed somehow to come to Paris, and with his knowledge of Yiddish and Polish, he went with us back into Bavaria. That was the first JDC team. And by prearrangement with the Army and with UNRWA, we were to be stationed at Feldafing, which was the first all-Jewish displaced persons camp in Bavaria. It had been a former German Army camp. And the other camp that quickly became an all-Jewish camp was Landsberg, which was not also in Bavaria and not many miles away. All right, you asked how I had met Klausner.
Klausner, yes.
We arrived with this team of, a total team of 5. I think we had, I don't know whether we had an ambulance or a jeep, but we came in under, for us, quite frustrating circumstances, and not only did Abe Klausner, but the DPs themselves expected. First, there was resentment that 2 months had elapsed between the end of the war or more than 2 months, between the end of the war and our arrival as the first JDC team in Bavaria. We'd had individuals going back and forth, but no program. And people, this was the period of greatest need for the people, and where have you been? And then when on top of that it was discovered that we were in no position to supply relief in any meaningful way at that point, there was considerable frustration and dissatisfaction with the JDC. You could explain that we couldn't get in until the Army and UNRWA gave us permission to get in, and they had other concerns which they thought were more important, like winding up the war and getting troops transferred to the Asian front, which for all anyone knew might be equally crucial and might go on for a long period of time. And in spite of all the noise we made in Paris and in Washington to pressure to get ourselves permitted to enter Germany, that was delayed, and by the same token, the JDC was under constant frustration in terms of bringing over personnel and supplies. Shipping was totally preempted for the military, and UNRWA looked upon us as a secondary agency. It felt that it had the primary responsibility in Germany and elsewhere, and in fact, when we first came into Bavaria, we were assigned to an UNRWA team that was then in Feldafing. We were under their supervision, and they were the agency to furnish supplies, and the Army, again, had raised this as an obstacle to our bringing in supplies. The program was theirs. Military government was in charge. UNRWA was the official agency for relief. All these obstacles, however, were difficult to understand by people who had been through what the Jews had been through in Germany, and by an Abe Klausner, who had already been working for months before we arrived. He had been working from, I don't remember exactly when he had started working on the DP problem. I think I recall he was with the Army in Germany during the war, and while the war was still going on, and ended up probably in Patton's army in Bavaria when the war ended, and then just simply separated himself for all practical purposes from the military service and addressed himself to what was, from his point of view, a much more important problem. So that very early after the war, I was in Germany when the war ended, in Baden-Baden, as a matter of fact, with this group of American ambulance drivers assigned to the French Army. I had seen, in the closing days of the war, no concentration camp, but I'd seen a few survivors of concentration camps who had been given some clothing and were being transported by military government or the army from one place to another. We moved on with the war before I could even ask many questions. I can imagine what the experience and the reaction of a chaplain who was right there and who, as I recall, was in Dachau at the end of the war and was able to see Dachau, as Abe Klausner did. I can imagine the extent of the emotions, the extent of the involvement, the extent of anger, mad, passionate anger at the disinterest of the Army about these poor survivors. And that's something I encountered also as soon as I got into Germany. The Army was a fighting organization. It was led by fighting officers, and the last thing in the world they were, or at least from their point of view, the last thing in the world they could be worried about very much was some civilian survivors. And this carried over after the war. They wanted to relax after the war was over and have fun, and the displaced persons became a problem, a difficult, demanding, complicated human problem, and the Germans, by contrast, were so easy to handle and so cooperative, so there was an unfriendliness by the Army towards the whole Jewish DP problem. And a chaplain on scene at that time would be the product of all these experiences. He would see the Jews dying on the one hand with inadequate health, inadequate food, inadequate medicine, inadequate clothing, and an army that even on the military government side, where presumably you had more civilian, ex-civilian types than you did in the army itself, an army that had no real sense of urgency about this. And so he took off on a career of, whatever you wanted to call it, outright taking of things. He capitalized on the chaos that follows in the wake of the sort of chaos in the routine of life that follows in the wake of an army. It was completely easy for him to come up to a warehouse that might be staffed by a sergeant and with some German help or some displaced persons and say, I requisition all this material here. And among other things, there was confusion on the military side because you had so many separate armies of separate nationals. The French army was in Bavaria, also in parts of Bavaria, and the British army was further north, but it was very easy for an aide to work as effectively as he did, but by no means could simply any person have done it. He had a tremendous amount of chutzpah, brilliance, tremendous strength as an individual, and passion, devotion. All right, so when did I meet him? We arrived in Feldafing in July of 1945. I was the only American. The others were all Europeans. We were totally inexperienced in relief work, all of us. We had no background with the JDC. My whole experience with the JDC had been those several months in Paris, where I'd learned a little bit about how the JDC operated. The JDC itself had never in its history had an experience or remotely comparable to that faced by it in the displaced persons camps. We just had so much to do and so little experience and knowledge and personnel and supplies to do it with. Plus the handicaps which flowed from being an agency which had to operate within the law, which Abe Klausner had learned he was not handicapped by.
In other words, you couldn't do the type of things.
We could never have done the type of things he did, because we might have jeopardized our stay in Germany. This was the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and we couldn't. We did some things, particularly in Berlin, where we were much stronger in 1946 and had much more by way of physical supplies and better personnel and knew our way around better. We did some fairly significant things there.
We'll get to that, I hope.
But in Bavaria at that time, it was for me personally a terribly frustrating experience. I had gone from bar mitzvah to the usual career of a second-generation American. My first generation, my parents came from the Soviet Union, so I guess I'm a first generation. Through school and college and law school, and I'd had very little to do with Jewish affairs, and all of a sudden I was literally clasped by these Jewish survivors to their bosoms as the representative of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, a healthy individual with a uniform, looked like I was the military, and who had so much they needed and so much to do, and I overnight became a Jew of complete dedication, and there was so little I could do.
Did Rabbi Klausner call upon you to
Well,
help?
he came in. I think that he heard we were coming in, and probably the very first day we were in Feldafing, he was there. And he introduced himself. He could not hide his resentment, the same resentment that the others felt at the lateness of our arrival, and the fact that we brought nothing with us, and the fact that we were still so disorganized throughout Europe. the JDC, as you know, had worked only in the underground behind the German lines. Now everything was open and liberated, and we had an office in Geneva, we had an office in Paris, and an office that was closing down in Lisbon. And again, it's a big, unwieldy organization, and if Schwartz worked 20 hours a day, those of us who were in the field in Bavaria maybe worked 18 hours a day.
This is Joseph Schwartz.
Yeah, and there was so much to do, and so I don't mean to have this sound like an apology for the JDC, but I'm trying to explain the hostility that Klausner felt towards the JDC, and which, though they concealed it more, the people felt. They were grateful for anything at that point. It was so good to have the JDC there, to have a Jewish organization. For the prior month or two, all they had was UNRWA, which might here and there have a Jew. But to have a Jewish organization meant so much to them, and the joint was so well known to the Polish Jews, particularly from World War I onwards. But they too, I remember Holzer making a speech in Yiddish to a group of the DPs in Germany. My Yiddish at that point was very poor. Later on it had improved somewhat, and I even could make some talks in Yiddish in Berlin, although there was one hilarious experience in a Berlin DP camp where Rabbi Philip Bernstein and I both attempted to make speeches in Yiddish. He's a Reformed rabbi, and he describes it. I think he's described it many times. The broken kind of Yiddish that we attempted to speak at. But Holzer, in some speech said, "We are not messiahs. We come here with very little at this point. It was impossible to do more." And this was thrown back at us. You know, this speech, "Wir seien nicht Mashiach," and they just expected so much from us. Well, what did we do in that period? We were certainly an important supplement to the UNRWA program. We were an important liaison between the UNRWA people and the people in the camps. They could not work. UNRWA could not work through a Klausner, and nor were they always successful in working with the people. And Dr. Haitan was extremely useful simply as a doctor. UNRWA had doctors, but relatively few. One pretty good one, I think his name was Kraus, a Jewish doctor in Bavaria. But there was so much to do. And Dr. Haitan was darn good in terms of liaison with Army medical people, in terms of getting medical supplies. He was a quite remarkable man. I don't know whether he's still alive. And he did a great deal. There were so many requests for simply help us contact people. We set up a tracing bureau very early. And this was of tremendous importance to the Jews.
You worked with Rabbi Klausner because he had the She'erit HaKlita?
Well, I went around a lot with Abe. I went with him to...
In other words, what I'm trying to find out from you is the type of relationship that existed between JDC and Rabbi Klausner.
Yes, of course. That's your focus of interest.
What's the relationship?
In spite of Abe's obvious hostility towards us and his quick recognition that he had done and was doing much more in terms of material supplies than we had done. And he also had raised Cain with the army a few times where it was significant, and he probably had gotten some, I don't know, he may have, I don't know to what extent he played a role in having Feldafing assigned as a camp. I just don't know. But I did early in the game, Abe took me around. He showed me everything in the Munich area. He took me to, that monastery that he had started, I believe. Well,
Saint-Étienne?
Saint-Étienne. Dr. Solomon Greenberg had really, I think, started it. He was a doctor, a displaced person, a man of great power, and he became the first head of the Central Committee of Liberated Jews in Bavaria, or whatever it was called. Abe took me to St. Ottilian, where I met Dr. Greenberg. Abe, I think, might have been, I'm not sure whether he was the first person to take me to Landsberg, which was the other DP camp. I'm not sure whether he introduced me to some of the Army people, but yes, I saw a lot of Abe.
In other words, when you had